Welcome to Leadership Lessons. My guest today is Jared Wilson, professor, author, and preacher. It's going to be an exciting episode. We're going to talk about Jared's books, some of his books. He's written a lot of them. We'll talk about preaching. We'll mention Midwestern Seminary. If time allows, we'll also get into social media, pastoral ministry, maybe burnout and fatigue, and some of those things that go along with ministry. If you're listening live or joining later, thank you for taking the time. We always hope that Leadership Lessons is a blessing in your life and that you hear something that would be helpful for your own ministry. If you're joining live, say hello. If you have questions that you'd like for me to ask Jared, send those along. And if we're able to get to them, then we certainly will. So let's jump right in. Jared, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me, brother.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up in Texas, actually, in the Rio Grande Valley. I was born in Brownsville, Texas, and grew up in Brownsville and McAllen, if anyone out there is familiar with the borderlands down there. And eventually ended up in Houston, Texas, and that's where I met my wife. And my family's there, and her family's there still. So Houston is kind of home for us. But I've lived all over. We moved from Texas to Tennessee in 1997, a year after I was married, and we were in Nashville, Tennessee for 12 years. And then I went to Vermont and pastored a church for 6 years in Vermont. And then now, for the last 6 years, I've been in Kansas City, Missouri. So I like to think that I'm kind of a citizen of the nation in a lot of ways.
You've been all over. You've been to Texas, Tennessee, then out in Vermont. Of all the places you've lived, what's one of your favorites?
Well, I did love New England a lot. I love Vermont. I felt at home there in a way that I didn't anticipate, especially being from Texas and living in the South. It just felt everything from the climate to the personality of the people. I just found really helpful to me and kind of a sense of at-homeness, for my own soul. And then even just, ministry-wise, Vermont is the least church state in the nation, and New England is the least, church region. I just saw stats today, actually, a couple hours ago, 2 to 4%. That's roughly the percentage of people who attend an evangelical church in New England or in the Northeast in general. And I actually found the clarity of that really refreshing. Speaking to people who they knew they didn't believe what you're trying to share with them. Right. There's something about the clarity there that actually I think was good for gospel ministry.
Jared, what differences did you notice just in general terms between the believers that you knew in Texas, Tennessee, and then the ones you met in Vermont and New England?
Yeah, it's a great question. Generally speaking, it's because it's not culturally expected or culturally even acceptable in a lot of places to be a church member or to go to church. What we tended to find in New England is that those who do attend church tend to be very serious about their faith, because there's not any other pressure, social pressure, or even family pressure, really, for them to do so. So you have it's a distinct minority, those who are committed to evangelical churches there, but it tends to be a more fervent kind of minority. Once you take kind of the cultural expectation out of it, it's people who go to church because they really do want to grow in community, and they really do want to hear the Bible preached, and they really do want to grow closer with Christ.
Any differences in how you did evangelism in Texas or Tennessee versus Vermont?
To some extent, yes. I found, the context, the evangelistic context, for instance, in Nashville, and I think it's changed significantly because Nashville is such a now very much a cosmopolitan, kind of multicultural place. But when I was there, and probably a little bit before that, I think you kind of had to weed through some of the assumptions people make based on church background, their family of origin. Gosh, yeah, I know what you're saying, because I've been a church member for 30 years, or my grandma took me to church, or I'm a church member at such and such place. And you kind of have to disentangle the cultural expressions of church with an actual committed relationship to Jesus, which for some, they just, they're trying to get in on their grandparents' faith, sort of thing. And, but the gospel is the gospel. It's still, that doesn't change no matter what context you're in. So once you can kind of weed through some of those cultural cultural barriers maybe. Once you got down to the message and maybe even apologetic questions, those are kind of the same. The one thing I just noticed in New England is that there's quite a few people who would identify as, spiritual but not religious.
Mm-hmm.
So there would be people that are kind of vaguely spiritual, maybe even kind of new agey sort of thing. And as much as people talk about how difficult New England is, or the Northeast is, a hard soil, so to speak, I always found it really invigorating to share the gospel there, because people will have spiritual conversations. They're not embarrassed by that. They may be, against, your message. They may be in some ways even hostile to Christianity based on their, preconceived ideas of it, or, stereotypes of bigotry or something like that. But just getting into the spiritual conversation, that's not a difficult subject to get into. They'll talk about spiritual things. In a lot of ways, the same ways, you've probably had this experience as well, like sharing the gospel with Muslims. In a lot of ways, sharing the gospel with Muslims is a lot easier than sharing the gospel with, like a rich white liberal elite, or even some, culturally, religious, people, because Muslims have zero hangups. They'll talk about religion. It's the air they breathe. So talking about religion is very easy.
They're interested. I was in a hotel one morning, felt led to go over and talk to a guy who was having breakfast, and I thought, how in the world are we going to have a conversation with this apparently, maybe possibly Muslim man? And I just started a conversation. Pretty soon he was telling me about Islam, and I was explaining Christianity to him, and he was aware and sharing the differences. So exactly what you said. So you've been in all these states. My guess is you probably have a favorite football team. Is it be Texas or in Tennessee, or where is your team?
Yeah, so my team is the New England Patriots. I'm a Patriots fan, and that actually started when I lived in Tennessee, which is kind of a long story. But thankfully, I was able to live in New England for a period of time, right when they were, kind of, neck deep in getting their six rings. So it was a great time to be there. And still kind of a Tom Brady fan as well. So I'm going to root for the Buccaneers as long as he's there. Once he's gone, I'll forget about the Buccaneers and stick with my Patriots.
I'm not a football fan at all. But Tom Brady's story is amazing. His success and abilities are just seem beyond that of others. So what do you do now, Jared? Tell us what your job or what your role is.
Yeah, so I serve as assistant professor of pastoral ministry at Midwestern Seminary and author in residence there as well. So I teach primarily classes related to ministry, basically introduction to pastoral ministry. Getting ready to do a class in the spring on gospel-centered preaching, and just helping young men who are training for the pastorate. That's where my heart is, and that's where the seminary's carved out a role for me. To where I also teach a writing class there as well, called Writing for the Church, and that's cross-listed, so undergrad can take that as well. We have Spurgeon College, which is our undergrad arm there at Midwestern, and I've got college students and seminary students in that class, but largely teaching seminary students pastoral ministry.
How long have you been at Midwestern?
So I came in February 2015, so just made 6 years. It was 2015 when I came.
So pastoral ministry involves caring well for people. It's probably broader than just the things you might think about: visitation, funerals, praying for folks going through hard times, ministering to counseling, maybe. What are some of the challenges of trying to teach that skill in a classroom to students? What makes that difficult to do?
Well, it's difficult to do primarily because the seminary can't really do what only the church is designed to do. We certainly cannot replace the kind of spiritual formation, the discipleship, the contextual sort of training. So, I have students, sometimes I'll have students from multiple classes, so I might get to know them over the period of a year or more. But by and large, I get a student for, 4 or 5 months, which, maybe some time to get to know a little bit of their personality, maybe a little bit of their background. But I can only kind of stay at the 30,000-foot level in talking about things like empathy and, a pastoral sensibility. So I can't, put that in someone's heart. Only the Holy Spirit can do that. And that is done through really the ministry of the word. So their local church is a far greater factor than me teaching the seminary class is. But what I try to do is actually come at those subjects, because what some pastoral ministry courses will do is sort of, okay, here's what preaching is. Here are some, tips and how to compose a sermon. Here are some things to do in terms of practicalities of baptism. Here are some, leadership strategies. And we talk about all those things. But really what I'm trying to do is actually get them to think at least along the terms of a pastoral heart, to see that the scriptures, the scriptures do allow, of course, for gifted, pastors, for talented, pastors, for dynamic speakers, those sorts of things. But when you look at the qualifications for for elders, for church pastors, 1 Timothy 3, Titus chapter 1, 1 Peter chapter 5, when you look at those qualifications, what you see is it's about character and disposition. You see kind of a pastoral sensibility. They're long-tempered, they're gentle, they're hospitable. They're not lovers of money. So it's a lot of character type things. And really, so what I'm trying to do is kind of calibrate the student towards that end. So while I can't create that in them, I do want to communicate to them that you can get an A in this class and still be a terrible pastor.
Yeah.
You can get all the answers right. But if you don't have a heart that is, communing with Christ on a regular basis and a heart for your people, like if you're not in this because you want to love people and help them to become more like Jesus, then it doesn't matter how good a speaker you are or how great a leader you are, in terms of your strategy and vision. It's about having a heart for Christ and for his flock.
Jared, when you're thinking about biblical examples of that pastoral heart, I'm assuming you're taking these students through the scriptures and you're probably showing them some folks in your mind who model that. Who comes to mind? Who do you think of as, obviously Jesus? And if Jesus is your answer, what would be some examples of that pastoral heart that you're trying to communicate to those students?
Well, yeah, I mean, Jesus, obviously is the greatest example that we could have for anything, for anything good and virtuous. I was talking to somebody this morning, just to kind of, camp out here on Jesus a moment. I was talking to somebody this morning about, the lesson that we learn just from Jesus's relationship with his disciples. These guys had the best seminary education that anybody could ever have, right? 3 years, close up, side by side, day after day, not like for 3 hours a week, but every single day with the God man, right? With the Son of God incarnate.
And with instant correction. Instant, yes. Perfect correction every time they did something wrong.
Yeah, just the example, the way just being with him should have rubbed off on them. But at the end of that 3 years, they still seem just as slow as they did in the beginning. I think of John chapter 13, where, Jesus is washing the disciples' feet. And we are just, mere hours away from Judas betraying him and Peter denying him. We're just a few hours away from Jesus anguished in the garden, and these jokers are sleeping, at his, direst need. And then when Jesus is crucified, which he has told them is going to happen, they're utterly confused. They all flee. They run away terrified, in the aftermath of that. And they seem really racked with confusion. And it's not till the resurrection that he comes back and begins to explain things to them. Something clicks sort of after the resurrection for them, which is great. But 3 years, give or take, of just complete morons these guys are. And yet there's never a moment where Jesus says, you know what, I obviously picked the wrong guys. I thought y'all were better than this. That moment never arrived. So if we're looking to Jesus as a pastoral model, we see such long suffering. We see such enduring grace, persistent, persevering grace. He's just an endless fountain of mercy. That to me is sort of like, okay, if I'm supposed to represent, I cannot be Jesus to somebody else, but if I'm supposed to represent him, and my pastoring is supposed to help people think of Jesus or know Jesus, I need to be a lot more patient than I am.
Yeah.
I need to be
long suffering comes to mind.
Oh man, I need to be a lot more forgiving than I am. Yeah. So I think that's one angle to take on it, probably.
Well, so when you're describing Jesus and the disciples there, and we're thinking about a seminary setting, I'm kind of thinking about the disciples as like seminary students. And for me, part of the reason I had a hard time learning from my professors is because I wanted to impress my professors. I wanted to tell them what I knew. I wanted them to say, "Wow, you're really something. You really are." And those guys did the same thing. That's what they were doing. They had their own thoughts and agenda about what that whole deal was to follow Jesus. Well, who else comes to mind, Jared, in terms of an example of the pastoral heart who's not Jesus in the scriptures?
Yeah, well, for me, Paul is probably the best example. And it's really interesting too, because Paul was, a church planter, an apostolic church planter. And so he's pastoring a lot of times from afar, right? He's not embedded on a weekly basis with one congregation. He's kind of pastoring the pastors and kind of pastoring the church through his letters and those sorts of things. But the sort of things that Paul says, right? We were gentle among you, like a nursing mother with with their children. Things that we don't typically think about when it comes to a model for pastoral ministry. Like if we
Yep.
if you or I were going to throw a pastoral ministry conference, we would not call it the breastfeeding moms, the nursing mothers pastors conference, right? But here's Paul looking at that as an example of his own pastoral disposition. He's wanting them to see like pastoral ministry is nurturing, and it's caring for the sheep. It's not just getting up in front of the sheep and yelling at them
Yep.
once a week. It's actually caring for them and tending to them, just as Jesus instructs Peter. And I love also Peter in 1 Peter chapter 5, his exhortation to the elders, where he basically says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you. And he adds the word eagerly. Yeah, eagerly there. Not begrudgingly. He says eagerly, as God would have you. There's something I think too about just the joy of yes, being a shepherd, but also just being among the sheep, getting to the end of your week and you've got wool on your jacket, and just finding such joy in that simple privilege of being stewarded a flock. There's such joy there. So Peter, helps us do that as well.
Jared, there are days in pastoring, I did it for 20 years, you pastored for a number of years, when that is the experience. You have that moment and you're thinking, Lord, this is the best thing ever. And it may have been a nursing home visit. You just finished a nursing home visit with an older saint, and you just know ministry happened, and you leave that visit. This is the best thing ever. But there are other days when that joy just isn't quite at that level. What do you do when the joy of ministry, how do you help a pastor who is really struggling with loving the people that God's assigned him to? He's experiencing more difficulty, maybe just with the flock he's called to serve. How do you help a pastor at that place to maybe fall back in love with that congregation?
Yeah, so it's, I think, a somewhat counterintuitive answer, but still kind of an obvious one, right? So we probably won't. We're not going to find sustaining joy in ministry within ministry itself. But so basically, trying to find validation, satisfaction, fulfillment in the work is misplaced, right? That fulfillment can only come from Christ himself, from being united with him through faith, through knowing that we have the irrevocable love of God given to us in Jesus, the good news of the gospel, which is for us every day. That's where the joy comes, and therefore the energy to pastor well, and even to find joy. I mean, you mentioned nursing homes and those sorts of things. I mean, I look back and think I dragged my feet with nursing home visits, shut-ins. I had a number of widows, who lived at home, and I would make on a Tuesday, I would make the rounds, and all day Tuesday, visit people who couldn't tweet about me. Had no.
They didn't want you to tweet about them either. They didn't want their picture on Twitter as well.
That's right.
Hey,
well, they wouldn't know if you did.
That's right.
They're not on Facebook. They're not, and they don't have a whole lot of influence in the congregation either. They don't carry a lot of weight, or they can't go to bat for you in particular ways. They essentially can do nothing for you, and yet, that to me was the most Christ-like ministry, because there's nothing we can do for Jesus either.
Yep.
So the closest we get to a Christ-like pastoring is when we give time, good, loving, intensive time, to people who can do nothing for us. And that's how you know, you're pastoring in the strength of Christ. And the only way I know to get there is not to see ministry as an end, to itself, but as the outworking of a relationship, a personal relationship with Jesus. If you're not finding joy in intimacy with Christ, you're always going to struggle to find joy in the work of ministry.
Yeah, well, that's incredible. And Jared, I want to affirm your work of trying to instill in students this notion of empathy and a heart for pastoral ministry and a heart for Jesus and a heart for people. I made a note to myself here about what you're trying to instill. So when I was in seminary, I had a professor, Dr. Cottrell. He taught crisis counseling at Southern Seminary. He'd been a medical doctor, and then the stress of it was hard on his heart. So he went into pastoring, and his doctor said that's worse. And so he was teaching at Southern Seminary. But he was really only trying to accomplish one thing in that crisis counseling class. It was Romans 12:15, to rejoice with those that rejoice and weep with those that weep. And he effectively did that. And so, man, all these years later for me, I come back to that verse and his time in that class. That's really all he was trying to get in our hearts and minds, was that's what you need to do, is the ministry of presence. And apparently you're doing that as well. Hey, who is an author that you really like in the field of pastoral ministry that you resonate with and you'd like for students to read his books?
Well, the most significant or influential book in my life outside the scriptures is Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
Which isn't specifically on pastoral ministry, but it has huge implications for it. And he speaks to ministry, to some extent in the book. And obviously, our theology wouldn't exactly line up with Bonhoeffer's at every point, but his picture of gospel-centered community is so helpful for me. So there was a portion I remember where he said, he warned against what he calls the wish dream, against visionary dreaming, and says we got to beware of the wish dream, and he cautions pastors to beware of the wish dream, because essentially the wish dream, which is the vision for the church that you want, right, where you want your church to go, how you want your church to be like, your vision for that on one level is a good thing, because you want your church to be growing, you want them to be maturing into Christ likeness, that sort of thing. But he said, if you become fixated on the wish dream, you'll always be measuring the church you have to that vision. And no one will ever measure up to an idealized version of themselves, which, by the way, includes pastors. I try to encourage pastors to remember congregations have wish dream pastors as well.
Well,
and
that's hard.
And how does it feel to know that they're constantly measuring you against some idealized version? So that was hugely instructive to me. I go back to Life Together probably once every 4 or 5 years, just as a good refresher. There's so much rich wisdom in it.
So one more question on your pastoral ministry class.
Sure.
Do you deal with the subject of pastoral failure, moral failure from leaders? And if you do, how do you deal with it? What do you try to communicate about that subject?
Yeah, we don't spend a whole lot of time on that subject. Mostly what we're trying to do is set up the positive vision of what might help, forestall such a thing. So personal accountability, relationship with, personal intimacy with Christ, of course, plurality of leadership that provides accountability, those sorts of things. But I do spend a little bit of time on the idea of restoration. And one point I try to make is, so I personally believe that fallen pastors can potentially be restored. I think we have that example with Christ with Peter, who's done one of the worst things anyone could ever do, is deny Jesus publicly. That's one of the worst moral failings you could have. And Jesus, as he's restoring him, he's not just restoring him to relationship, he's actually restoring him to ministry, because he's saying, feed my lambs, tend to my sheep. So I take that as, okay, it's possible. The reason I don't think we see it happen very often is because there's such a desire to instantly be restored to a position, and we don't give people time, or they don't give themselves time to see how satisfying Jesus is, because they're trying to use their relationship with Christ as a means back into the spotlight or back into a position of authority. And that kind of short circuits what needs to happen to develop those qualifications for eldership, a reputation for those qualifications again. So one thing I do say to the students is, even if you haven't had a moral failing, you're working towards a disqualification if ministry becomes your joy greater than Christ, greater than Christ,
So you're trying to protect students from becoming pastors who have a moral failing, and then try to help a church where that has happened. The impact is, and collateral damage is so much further than just this incident with this, with this leader. It sure impacts a much broader community and makes it difficult for a church to overcome as well. The more students are aware of that reality, I think it's probably helpful. So coupled with your being assistant professor of pastoral ministry, you're also director of Pastoral Training Center at Liberty Baptist Church in Kansas City. Is that correct? Are you still in that,
yes,
in that
sir.
role?
Yes,
so
sir.
It sounds like that's kind of the practical arm of maybe the lived out arm of the pastoral ministry teaching or training.
It is, yeah. And that's where sort of that local church piece factors in. So I've got, it's an 18-month program. We've now been through 2 of them. We'll start our 3rd one next year. So I've been doing it now. How long would that be then? Oh, about 4 years, I guess. We'll start our 3rd one next year. It's guys training for ministry. They're members of the church. We bring them in. It's very spiritual formation, discipleship based. So we're not trying to replicate seminary experience. We're trying to do what the church is best designed to do. So we do things in ecclesiology, church, polity, things like that. They do read a book every month and write a paper on it. But a large part of it is one-on-one time with me, group time together. My wife adopts the wives. They have a separate time together each month as well. And it's just about trying to pour into these young men, and if they're married, into their wives, that we can aim at the character, at those qualifications. That's really where we're pressing in more on kind of the life on life sort of thing that we can't do in the seminary context, at least not to the degree that the church can. But through the local church, it's my primary field of discipleship of having a set of young guys.
Is this something you'd like to see other churches do, Jared? And if so, have you seen other churches kind of pick up this model of equipping people for pastoral ministry?
Yes, I think it's catching on. It's certainly not a new idea by any stretch, but I think we're seeing a resurgence of it. I mean, when I was a young man, wanting to aspire to ministry, there would be internships, things like that in churches. But largely what it was is like the idea you go to seminary, they'll train you to be a pastor, and then you're missing kind of that local church kind of component. It's almost like you press pause on being developed by a church to some extent. Now, of course, if you're in seminary, you can find a local church a lot of times, where you can grow and become a member and those sorts of things. But now to say we're actually going to try to, home grow our next generation. So not only are these guys that we're going to send out to pastor, to church plant, to do those sorts of things, but we want to create a generational, cycle of succession here, so that our next pastors can be people who, they have the DNA of our church. They know our people, and our people know them, and it really mitigates against some of the complications that can come otherwise. So from the first round of residents, we have 2 of the guys who serve in ministry roles in our church. One is our student ministry director. One is our creative arts director, our worship director. And then we have at least 3 of our pastors have actually gone through the residency. So it's become a good kind of, field, field training. That's right.
Yep. Sounds like it's your leadership pipeline. I learned pastoral ministry by doing pastoral ministry.
Same here.
And that I was just put into a church. I'm now pastoring this church, and I'm like, oh, they expect me to go see these people when they're sick, and even when they're not sick, and learned to love it. But there sure was a great learning curve. Well, Jared, you are an author of 20 plus books. I have a list here of some of the books that you've been part of: Imperfect Disciple. You wrote Explicit Gospel with Matt Chandler, Gospel According to Satan. Looks like you did a 12-week Bible study or commentary on Romans, Gospel Driven Church. I have a couple of your books here: Supernatural Power for Everyday Life, Experiencing God's Extraordinary Spirit. You're not that old. You're 46, I think.
45.
So
Let's not get ahead of
45,
ourselves,
you're
brother.
not even that old. So how do you find time to write all these books?
Well, I don't know how not to do it. I've been a writer for a long time, and I've always been writing. Even since I was a little kid, I was writing short stories and all sorts of things. And you know, when I in college, I was wanting to be a novelist as well. So all the while I was trained for ministry and had in mind, you know, that I'm going to be in you know, vocational ministry, I also knew I wanted to write, and originally was wanting to write fiction. So I mean, I got an agent really early on as a novelist, and just couldn't get published as a novelist. And eventually, we planted a church in Nashville, Tennessee, and I shifted my focus because so much of my energy was wrapped up in the ministry at that point that I didn't have time to write fiction. And so I just began translating my sermon series into kind of book outlines or book chapters, and became a nonfiction guy that way. But for me, it's hard to turn the ideas off. I always, you know, when blogging became a thing, I had a friend that kind of pulled me into blogging before I even knew what that was. He was like, we had an email discussion group where we would read different books and kind of discuss them over email. And he said, you know, we could put this on a weblog. And I just said, I don't even know what's a weblog? And he said, well, it's like what we're doing now, but other people can read it. And I said, oh, I guess we could do that. And then I'm a blogger all of a sudden. I had no idea what a blogger was. And, so I've always been doing it. It's hard for me not to write.
What's one of your most read books?
By far, I think my most read book is The Imperfect Disciple, which came out, I think, 3 or 4 years ago from Baker Bookhouse. That's my best-selling book by far.
Yep, I read that. What book did you wish would have received greater attention than it has received?
Well, all of them for sure, but
yeah. But which one? Which one, when you wrote it, you're like, man, this is really going to be well received, and maybe it wasn't as much as you would have thought.
So I wrote a book called Gospel Deeps, which is probably my personal favorite of all my books.
Yeah.
It was, I think, my third or fourth book, actually. It was pretty early on, 2012 or 2013. And it just basically holds up the gospel like a diamond, and each chapter just kind of looks at a different facet of the good news of Jesus. And I just really enjoyed kind of exulting in the goodness of Jesus, and kind of rejoicing in grace, and kind of looking at all these different angles of grace. And it was a book I enjoyed writing. It was really helpful to me spiritually to write. And so whenever somebody says it's their favorite of my books, I feel a kinship with that person, because it's not.
You have a new best friend. Yep.
That's right. It's not one of my better read books, I don't think.
Well, so we had Don Whitney here in the Baptist Building in Louisville to teach about his Praying Through the Psalms. And I'd read his book on assurance of salvation along with others. And I told him that his book on assurance of salvation had meant a lot to me. He said, you're the first person ever to say that. And it was a book that I think meant a lot to him, but just didn't receive the attention of a lot of his other books.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That it happens. So, you put your heart and soul into these things, and you just never know how they're going to be received.
So a new book that you've written is called Love Me Anyway. Why did you write this book? The subtitle, How God's Perfect Love Fills Our Deepest Longing. So what prompted that book?
Yeah, well, it began as the kernel of it began as a sermon that I preached at our church, Liberty Baptist Church, all from John chapter 13, actually. The scene where Jesus is washing the feet of the disciples. But in John 13:1, it says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And I just began to explore what it means for Christ to love us completely, to love us totally, to love us forever. And that subject, of course, is the most popular subject in the history of mankind. The idea of love, not necessarily God's love, but love itself. We're always, everybody deep down wants to be loved. We want love more than we want food and water, I think, even, right? You don't need love to live, but you need love to want to live, probably. And, it's been around since the very beginning. So I just began to kind of tease out all the different ways we try to experience love, to get love, right? Looking for love in all the wrong places, that sort of thing. And thought, okay, the most famous chapter in the Bible, apart from probably John 3:16 or maybe snatches of the Sermon on the Mount, is 1 Corinthians 13, where we see Paul describing what love is like, what real love is. It's read at every wedding, even among unbelievers, if they want kind of a whiff of religion in their wedding, 1 Corinthians 13 is to weddings what Amazing Grace is to funerals, right? You're going to hear it there. And oftentimes with people who have no idea actually what it calls us to, the kind of self-crucifixion and self-emptying it calls us to. So I just thought, let's journey through that chapter. So every chapter in the book covers a different clause from 1 Corinthians 13, and exploring all the different ways we try to get love, to feel love, experience love, and how God's love actually brings healing and fulfillment to us. So it's not I do talk about romance and marriage in the book, of course, but I also talk about friendship. I talk about the experience of church, church community, the experience of love in a church. So it's not a romance book or a marriage book per se.
Sure.
But it's about how God's love actually fulfills that deep longing we all have.
Okay, so one quote from the book is from 1 Corinthians: "Love is patient." And you make this statement. You say, "Love is patient because love gives people space to be themselves. If you love someone, you give them room to breathe." So interact with that quote and just tell us a little bit about the context and what you're thinking there.
Yeah, well, I had to come up with a definition of love because the Bible nowhere says this is the definition. It has lots of descriptions, and 1 Corinthians 13 is one of the most direct, like what is the impact or the experience of love. And so, putting the biblical data together, and seeing Christ as the embodiment of love and seeing God as himself love, according to 1 John, I decided that the definition of love is an orientation towards others for their good and their glory. And certainly that is within the Godhead, the Trinitarian love. They are rejoicing in the being of each other. The Father loves the Son because he's the Son, not because the Father lacks anything that the Son makes up in him. Right. They share the same essence. They are equal. They're simultaneously eternally God. But he rejoices that the Son is the Son, and he loves the Son because the Son is the Son, and he loves the Spirit, and etc. You see this sort of, well, that spills out. There's not anything in us that God needs. There's no deficiency in God that he would create us because we filled some kind of hole in himself or anything like that. He created us to reflect his glory. And he loves us because he loves us, because he himself is love. And he wants our good. His plans for us are our good. Even when the wicked perish, he takes no joy in that. And he wants us to be glorified, not in the same way he is glorified, of course, but to be sort of restored to a sinless glorification. That's the aim of salvation, that when Christ returns and vanquishes all sin and death, we will enjoy glorified bodies that are similar to Christ's glorified body, and will live forever with him, reflecting his glory. So if I take that idea and say, now, okay, for me to love you, what does that look like? Well, that means I'm going to be oriented towards you in such a way that I desire your good, not your failure, not your diminishing, but your genuine good. And sometimes that can be stern or harsh, because if you're engaged in sin, or if I'm engaged in sin, your love for me doesn't mean you approve of that. You might have to rebuke me or hold me accountable or seek even justice if I've wronged you in some way. That's for my good, actually, to be involved in that restoration. And it's for my glory as well, because the way God has designed me to be before the fall isn't one who is engaged in sin and disorder. And so for me to be properly glorified as a creature, to reflect the image of God as the true glory, I'm going to be someone who repents from sin. I'm going to be someone who's pursuing, goodness and kindness and faithfulness and those sorts of things. So that's the definition I arrive at, which means when I love somebody, to truly love them, it means I'm going to be patient with them, and I'm not expecting them to measure up to a standard that I myself don't measure up to. But I'm going to be forgiving. I'm going to do as Paul says in Romans 12. I'm going to outdo them, showing honor. I'm going to love them with brotherly affection, because they are them, because God has made them who they are. And so I'm going to actually love them and not what they can do for me or how they make me feel.
Well, that's a whole mind. I mean, it's a right mind shift. It's an entire mind shift, though, in thinking. You make this statement. You say, think of what love might result if we all put each other's interest ahead of our own. We'd find ourselves in a beautiful stalemate. what do you mean by the beautiful stalemate part? Explain that.
Yeah, so I've actually stolen that idea from a friend of mine, Ray Ortland, who's a pastor in Nashville, or he's pastor emeritus at Emmanuel Church. He's the one who first turned me on to really staring at Romans chapter 12, verse 10. Love each other with brotherly affection, outdo one another, showing honor. And he said, if we're each trying, if the competition is to out honor each other, we're going to end up in this beautiful stalemate. He said, like,
that's great.
We're each saying after you, no, after you, no, after you. And that's the beautiful stalemate. So now we're stuck basically in this mutual respect for each other and a mutual deference towards each other. And it's much better than trying to jockey for position or trying to get ahead of each other.
Oh, Jared, that's really good. That's not what I mean. That's really not kind of what at least social media Christianity looks like right now. It doesn't look like a beautiful stalemate. But somebody has to be the bigger person there, and somebody has to become the more loving person and say, I'm going to go ahead and love you in this time. So let me ask you about 1 Corinthians 13. In verse 7, Paul says about love, it bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. The part about believes all things, what's your understanding of what Paul's communicating, that love believes all things?
Yeah, I think in the trajectory of the passage, and I could be wrong about this, but I think what he's talking about is what we would describe as kind of believing the best, right?
Yeah.
Until someone has given you actual evidence of a failure or a wrongdoing, that we in a sense become an advocate for them in our minds, that we believe the best about them, we give them the benefit of the doubt, that we don't jump to a conclusion or have an assumption about their motives or and that's certainly applied. You mentioned social media. That's something that I've had to learn the hard way. There are times where people will ask a question that seems snarky or critical, or they'll say something that's, that just seems slightly off. And there are times in the past and perhaps even in the present where that just rubs me the wrong way. I think somebody's coming at me or they're trying to attack me, and I'll just go back at them. But now I feel like I've gotten to a better reflex. So when that happens, I sort of pause. I'll pull up their feed and kind of scroll through and see how do they interact with other people. Is this maybe
good.
Is there something here I'm missing? Maybe there's something that's missing because it's the internet and it's not I can't see their face, and they didn't mean it to sound like the way they typed it, or or maybe they're being sarcastic in a appreciative way with me and I misread it because I don't know them and they actually think they're being friendly. So those are things, I think, ways to believe the best about people. And I think that's what Paul's talking about, is essentially being an advocate, having the default position towards advocacy for people rather than accusation.
That's incredible. I mean, that's a game changer for all of our interactions. If we start out with, I'm going to go ahead and believe the best about you until you convince me that I can no longer believe the best about you. We're sure going to be in a much better place. Well, I want us to talk about Midwestern Seminary. So you're at Midwestern. Of all the SBC schools, I assume that's your favorite, that if you have a coffee cup, it's a Midwestern Seminary coffee cup. What is unique about Midwestern, maybe of the 6 SBC schools?
Oh, gosh. Well, without much background in the other schools, but just having a little bit of cursory familiarity with them, I certainly don't mean to denigrate anybody. But what I love about Midwestern is the slogan for the church is more than a slogan. That was something when I came to Midwestern, I got a phone call in 2014. I was invited to come speak at the very first For the Church conference, which is a national conference we put on every single year. And so before I was employed there, I just was a speaker at the conference. And I didn't really know much about the seminary world. Midwestern, of course, was not really high on my radar. I knew most about Southern Seminary and to some extent Southwestern, having grown up in Texas as well. So it was kind of a no reputation seminary in my mind. And I came to speak at the For the Church conference. 2 weeks later, I was pastoring in Vermont at the time. 2 weeks later, they called, asked if I'd be interested in coming to work there to sort of help build this vision that Dr. Jason Allen had, that the church would be remarried, or whether the seminary would be remarried to the ministry of the local church. That's why we exist, to serve the church, to train leaders for the church, explicitly, consciously. And I thought, you know what? My wife and I have been praying about what our next season of ministry ought to be. That's been somewhat confusing for us because I came to Vermont thinking I was going to be here for a very long time. And everything sounded right. But as I came to work, my antenna is up. Like, is it just branding? I have a very low tolerance for that sort of thing. And I was working in the communications department when I first came, and so I was a part of crafting this message of we're for the church and we train leaders for the church. And I just thought, if that's all this is, number one, people will see right through it, right? Yep. After a while, people are not dumb; they will catch on if this is just a slogan. But I will see right through it, and I don't want to be any part of that. And what I've discovered in being there is how many of our professors are dedicated churchmen. So many of them are bivocational; they serve as pastors in their church, or they're lay elders in a church. And we're asked. I mean, we're held accountable for this every year as part of the faculty review. In particular, you have to give an account for your service in your church, how you've grown as a churchman over the past year. So it's something that we are dedicated to beneath the surface level, and that to me has just been so wonderful and so helpful. That my place of employment desires that my church would flourish, and that I would be dedicated to serving my church. When I announced I was going to be leading this residency, there was no one at the seminary that thought, oh, this is going to compromise his ability to do this or that, or, for them it was like, oh, this is fantastic. This is exactly what we want. Our professors who are deeply invested churchmen, not just church attenders, but really serious invested churchmen.
Well, Southern Baptists we're at our best when everything that we do outside the local church is aimed at helping the local church. So,
Amen.
Kudos to Midwestern for that. So you brought up social media. You're active on social media. In fact, you have 57,000 followers on Twitter, best I can tell. And you mentioned maybe a mistake or two that you have made on social media. Can you reference? All of us have made mistakes, Jared, so don't feel bad about that. Can you any particular mistakes that you've made on social media that are kind of like general mistakes that I've made that I'd like to not make again, or anything in particular?
Yeah, well, it's been a while, and I think, honestly, Todd, I think part of it is when you get older, don't you? You just kind of lose your taste for some battles, for some skirmishes, and
are you asking me about getting older? So I'm 10 years older than you.
Okay. Well, I just mean you tend to mellow. I think maturing in Christ, if you're walking with Christ, you tend to mellow out as you get a little older. I think it's a good thing.
So, Jared, I've heard this. I'm in my 50s, mid-50s. I'll be 57 in November.
Okay.
50s have been my favorite decade so far of life. Pete Scazzaro recently did a podcast that dealt with aging. And he mentioned some folks he's talked to in their 70s and 80s, and they said to him, I forget the order, so someone could check it and get it right. But I think they said these folks said that their 70s was their favorite decade and felt it was the most spiritual, impactful. 60s was the second favorite. 80s was the third. But all their favorite decades of leadership, what they felt like was impact and fruit bearing and satisfying, was happening past the age of 60. So I think aging is a good thing. It's meant to be embraced, and hopefully some good things come along with it.
Yeah, I just think in my younger days I had a lot of nervous energy that I was working out and attending every argument I was invited to, and and seeing and honestly seeing even things that are certainly important but not essential. Debates over tertiary things, maybe eschatology, or even the finer points of soteriology and those sorts of things. Things I still have, certainly perspectives on, and certainly have, viewpoints about, but which I have zero interest in arguing with anybody about anymore. So I think early on it was just attending every invitation to an argument that somebody issued to me, taking a lot more things personally. I think, also over time you just develop a thicker skin, and so if somebody insults me or they're trolling me, so to speak, I don't get flustered by that like I did probably 15 years or so ago. And I think I'm a lot more comfortable in my own skin. And gosh, once you've been in ministry for a while, right? There's things you go through that just the stuff on the internet just doesn't even, it pales in comparison. It's like, once you've held the hands of dying church members, and once you've had, people, stab you in the back in your church, it's just things like that. When somebody on the internet gets, been out of shape, I'm just kind of like, well, that's adorable that they think,
Yeah.
something.
And maybe someone that you don't even know, Jared, and probably usually the case. So I'm assuming if you're dealing with you're teaching students that occasionally social media etiquette comes up. What are two or three things that you encourage folks to either pitfalls to avoid or things to keep in mind as you're engaging? Because it can be a tool, it can be a helpful tool that, and in many ways can be, I mean, effective and encouraging. But what either something to avoid or something to keep in mind.
Yeah, well, there's something that happens on the online platform where we don't necessarily forget that I'm a human being talking to a human being, but because it's mediated through a screen and text, it almost becomes a dehumanized process. So we end up saying things to people that we would never say, or I hope that we would never say, sitting at a coffee table across from them,
Right.
or in the living room across from them, or in a pastor's study across from them. So I just try to remind folks to not say anything online that you wouldn't say directly to a person in person.
Yeah.
Just in terms of who they follow as well, my experience on Twitter has radically changed when I learned how to effectively use the mute button, to be honest, and the block button. There's certain voices that I know either they're not reliably peaceable people, or I don't become reliably peaceable when I am exposed to what they're saying. So maybe it's not necessarily something is wrong with them per se, but I just am tempted in certain ways, and I need to create a boundary here. So I just cut them off from me being able to hear them. And then I just sort of think, because I try to be myself on social media, and I use the different platforms in different ways. I goof off a lot more on Instagram than I do on Twitter. I pretty much just joking around on Instagram by and large. But on Twitter, something, I joke around quite a bit, but really I'm also trying to contribute some casting a vision of the gospel and gospel centrality there. And so I just want to ask people, like almost as a diagnostic question, if I read through, or if anybody read through the last week of your tweets, what would they gather is the most important thing to you? Not just what's important to you, but the most important thing. If they could sum it up, where are you spending most of your energy? What are you talking about the most? And when I apply that to myself, I think I want people to know or to think that Jesus and his gospel is the most important thing to me. And if that's what I want people to take away from their experience of my tweets, I need to make sure I'm proclaiming Jesus, that I'm talking about how great Jesus is, that I'm magnifying Jesus in my Twitter. If you have a different aim with Twitter, then of course you'll have different means of achieving that. But I think for Christians, especially in ministry, I think it's a tragedy that if somebody read the last week of our tweets, they'd walk away saying the most important thing to them is college football, or the most important thing to them is politics.
Sure, absolutely.
Which doesn't bar having opinions in any of those things, because
or having fun, like posting your preaching in a Ramones T-shirt. pretty interesting. Right. So, hey, let me ask you before we finish up our time. I listened to a recent podcast that you were in, and you mentioned a season in your life. You were referencing the series of Christianity Today podcast on Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill, Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and you guys were interacting and offering your thoughts about the podcast there. But you referenced Mark Driscoll's preaching and John Piper's preaching at a time when you were personally going through kind of a dark season or period in your own life. I'm really not as concerned about the preaching of Driscoll or John Piper, but what could you share about that dark season, Jared? Lots of pastors either are, have been, or will go through a dark season. So what could you share with us about that?
Yeah, it was the worst time of my life, and by God's mercy, I was not in an active ministry position at that time. I actually did not understand why. In fact, that was part of my hurt and my confusion. Was I believe the Lord had called me into ministry, and I had been serving in student ministry roles up to that point, and then I found myself a member of a church serving in a layman's capacity. And every door I tried to step through for ministry the Lord wouldn't open, and I didn't understand that. Well, I wasn't qualified is the whole point. My marriage was a wreck. My life was a wreck. Wow. And, I was living in the guest bedroom of our home there in Nashville. And, a period of depression really just sort of enshrouded me. And, you just pray differently in those days. I never lost my faith, but it was a pretty weak, beat up faith.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just kind of like, clinging to the hem of Christ's garment. That's kind of where I was. Just maybe, I don't think he likes me, but maybe I can find some kind of sliver of hope here. And I was wrestling with suicidal ideation and all sorts of things like that. And what I discovered in that time, my lifeline was, because I was going every week to a church that had preaching, but it was very much a kind of therapeutic kind of, it was the seeker church kind of thing, attractional church. And it was a lot of pull yourself up by your bootstraps type stuff, which not only didn't solve my issues, but actually made them worse, because I had bottomed out. I came to a place of complete inability. I was utterly broken. My life was a smoking crater, and here's somebody saying, you can do it, and I thought, man, the way my life is a reflection of the reality that I cannot do it. I need something else. And so what I discovered in the preaching of those two guys, and it could have been, anybody else, but somebody recommended them, and was, first of all, the idea that the gospel is for Christians, not just for lost people. That was utterly revolutionary for me. And I grew up in the church. I grew up in faithful gospel preaching churches, even. But the assumption in those churches was the gospel's for the lost, and once you have it, then you move on to other things. And so it was a very much performance-based, kind of production-based idea of discipleship and those sorts of things. And so just the very idea that there was grace that covered me on a daily basis, that I wasn't as good as what I hadn't done. Really the idea of the imputation of Christ's righteousness, that I'm counted righteous in Christ, not just forgiven, as wonderful as that is. And if that's all it was, it would still be eternally fantastic. But I'm forgiven and counted righteous in Christ. His obedience is credited to me. That just, I came to my senses like the, prodigal son. Just one night in particular, I don't remember the date, but what the preaching did for me from those two men was sort of point me in the direction of Christ as my satisfaction, even as a beat up, lousy believer. At the end of my rope, there was Jesus, and he wasn't turning his back on me. That's what I hope any pastor who finds themselves in any period of discouragement, depression, there's not a day where Jesus says, I thought you were better than this.
Well,
you disappoint me. It never happens, because you don't surprise him. He knew exactly what you were going to do, what was going to happen to you. He knew exactly what he was getting into with you. And I just find that incredibly good news and really encouraging.
Well, thank you, brother. So, hey, let me a couple of quick questions before we finish up.
Sure.
One of the best books you've read in the past year. Does anything come to mind?
In the past year, I'm about halfway through John Steinbeck's East of Eden.
Really?
Which is one of those classics of American lit, and I'm reading it very slowly, but it's really deep. Has a lot of biblical allusions to it, in particular to Cain and Abel and those sorts of things. Really helpful. And I'm also about done with Ray Ortland's book, The Death of Porn, which is written in a very kind of it's written in the format of letters of a father to a son. And so it reads almost like wisdom literature, kind of like a pastoral fatherly heart, which is a really unique approach to that subject. There's lots of books out there about sexual purity and those sorts of things, but this is a really unique approach, and it's really been impressive to me.
Some of the best ministry advice you've ever received?
Ministry isn't everything. Christ is.
That's so good. I mean, at some point, you've got to decide that if ministry becomes an idol, it's a poor substitute for God, and it'll be a disappointing one as well. You have to kill the idol and get back to loving and serving Jesus. Your best pastoral or personal care, best personal self-care practice, the best thing you do to care well for yourself.
Yeah, apart from the spiritual disciplines, the kind of unique thing that I like to do is go sit outside with no distractions, no surfing the phone, but just sit outside and look at the sky. I started that when I lived in Vermont, and I actually had a little area in our backyard where we didn't have cell coverage at all at our rural home. But there was a corner in the backyard where our deck was, where the Wi-Fi didn't reach either. So even if I wanted to get distracted on my phone, I couldn't. And I would just go sit out there, and we had a logging trail that went up this a mountain, behind our house. And I would just stare at the trees, and I would stare at the sky. And there's just something about praying and enjoying, the vision of nature. And even today, I live in a suburban neighborhood. I'll go just sit out on the deck and look at the sky, watch the planes coming in, over us to the airport, or sit in my garage and watch the neighborhood street like some old man who likes to sit on his front porch, that sort of thing.
You're gonna age really well, Jared. I can see it. Man, I went through a really tough season of burnout, and one of the things that pulled me out of it was the discipline of solitude. And I carry a lawn chair in my car right now. And if I can find 15 minutes to pull over somewhere and sit under a shade tree with a cup of coffee, I'm not there to read or pray or anything else. I'm just going to sit and enjoy. It's life-giving. Hey, man, thank you for the time. Thank you for investing in Kentucky Baptist. Thank you for coming to Pastors Conference. You're going to preach for us at the Press On Pastors Conference in November. So we look forward to seeing you in Kentucky in Elizabethtown at that time. Can I pray for you before we cut loose?
Yes, sir. Please do. I'd love it.
All right. Dear Lord, thank you for Jared and your calling on his life. Thank you for his investment in students, the books that he has written. Lord, we pray for him that you'd multiply him and make him 1,000 times as many more as he is right now, and that you'd bless him, his family, those students, the seminary where he serves, the church where he serves, and that you would use him to just help others to walk with Jesus, to love him and love other people. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you, Jared.
Thank you, brother. It's been a pleasure.
You just heard from Jared Wilson. Next week, my guest will be Pastor Greg Lakes from Pilot Knob Baptist Church, and I hope you can join us.